In the last video, we talked a little bit about Revelation 20 and the 1,000-year reign, the Millennium. And we discussed briefly 3 different ways of approaching that passage. We referred to the post-millennial view and the pre-millennial view and the amillennial view. What I want to do in this session is explain to you how I read the Millennium and what I think it's saying, and the view that John held to himself. Just kidding. But how I read Revelation chapter 20. And what I want to do is pay a special attention to how it seems to be working and functioning within Revelation itself. What does John say about it? What's it doing there? Now, the first thing that I want you to notice about Revelation chapter 20 is it's so cryptic in its reference. John doesn't tell us what happens during the millennium, except he just says they came to life and they reigned with Christ. And it doesn't even tell us where. We assume that's probably on earth, but it could be in heaven. It doesn't say. It doesn't tell us where God's people reign with him. Is it on heaven? Is it on earth? Revelation 20 doesn't say. And notice it doesn't say what happens there. It doesn't tell us that this is where Israel's promises get fulfilled. This is where Israel gets restored to the land. This is where God's people live and they spread the gospel and they spread righteousness and peace. And this is a place where a time of prosperity and blessing, and this is a place or time where the temple's built. Revelation 20 says none of that. That doesn't mean that that's wrong, but it just means that when you look at chapter 20, you have to import those ideas from elsewhere in the Bible. Revelation 20 itself does not say what happens during the millennium other than the saints come to life and they reign with Christ. That's all it says. And again, it's not clear where this takes place, whether it's on heaven or whether it's on earth. Now, the other thing that I want to notice that I think is important for understanding this, that chapter 20, the entirety of, or most of chapter 20 is about the judgment of Satan. Now, back in chapter 12 and 13, we were introduced to sort of the satanic trinity. It started with the dragon Satan and then his 2 beastly cohorts, Beast 1 and Beast 2. And now what we find happening in chapter 19 and 20 is John now disposes of those 3 characters in reverse order. They're disposed of in judgment. So the 2 beasts are judged in chapter 19, and then in chapter 20, that's the judgment of Satan. So I would suggest to you that most of chapter 20 is about the judgment of Satan. And it's in the midst of the judgment of Satan that we find this reference to the millennium, the 1,000-year reign. And so the question I think we should be asking is, why does John mention this 1,000-year reign of Christ in the midst of his account of Satan, the dragon's judgment that he clearly refers to? And you'll notice Satan's judged kind of in two stages. He's thrown into the abyss and locked up, and then he's let out to go into judgment and destruction. He's destroyed and thrown into the lake of fire in chapter 20 as well. And it's right in the midst of that you have this reference to the millennium, the 1,000-year reign. And so the question is, what is it doing there? What's John saying? The first thing I want to say to you is, I agree with those that would see the 1,000 years as symbolic or metaphorical. In other words, it is not meant to give us a reference to a literal time period. It's not saying that this millennium will last 1,000 literal years of 360 days. Instead, the number 1,000 is metaphorical. The number 1,000, it's just a huge number, a number of great magnitude. It's meant to suggest a large amount, a large number. And so what I think is going on is most likely the 1,000 years, in my view, does not refer to a period of time at all, at least a long period of time. Instead, it's just a metaphor to describe the vindication of the saints, the fact that they come to life and they're raised and they reign with Christ. That's all the 1,000 years refers to. It's not referring to a long period of time, of a literal 1,000 years or more. It's just a metaphor that refers to the event of Christ, God raising his people, and then and then having them reign with Christ. And I take it that chapter 20 happens at the second coming of Christ. So I think chapter 19, the rider and the white horse coming in the final battle, I think everything after chapter 19 refers to what happens at the second coming of Christ. So I think the millennium does happen at the second coming of Christ. But I don't think it's describing a long period of time. It's just describing and referring to the single event of God vindicating his people by raising them and having them reign with Christ. And that's basically all that the millennium refers to. Now, why does he do that? Well, again, as I said, the millennium occurs within the context of the judgment of Satan. And you think about it, if the other place where, as we said, you find any mention or detailed description of the dragon is back in chapter 12. And you saw in chapter 12, basically, the dragon in chapter 12 is described as the accuser of the brothers. He's the one that he pursues them and puts them to death and tries to destroy them. And Satan is the one who reigns over the world. I think of Paul's letter where he describes the ruler of the authority of the air. Satan is seen as the ruler. He reigns and he rules, especially through the Roman Empire of that day, of the first century. Satan reigns and he rules, and he puts the people of God to death. He's the accuser. And now what we find going on with the millennium, this is to be seen as a reversal of the way Satan treated them. Satan ruled over them and put them to death. Now, to reverse that, they come to life and they reign. And that's all that the millennium refers to. It's to kind of be seen as the vindication of the saints. In the midst of judging Satan, it's as if John wants to make clear, God giving John this vision, that God has not forgotten his people. He vindicates them in the context of judging Satan. He now reverses the way they were treated under Satan. Again, Satan reigned over them, especially through Rome in the first century, but all throughout history, church history, Satan reigned over them, the dragon ruled over them, and the dragon put them to death. Now, to reverse that, they come to life. Satan put them to death, they come to life. Satan ruled over them, but now they reign. One way to maybe understand that, you think about that, as I said, Revelation 12 refers to Satan as the accuser of the brothers. So what happens if someone is wrongfully accused and the guilty party then is found to be guilty? What happens to the people that were wrongfully accused? Well, they need to be vindicated. And that's, in a sense, what you find Revelation chapter 20 doing. In the midst of the judgment of Satan, those that he wrongfully accused, he's the accuser of the brethren, those that he put to death, those that he oppressively and wrongfully ruled over, now they are vindicated. They come to life and they reign. It's as if the millennium demonstrates that their suffering for the sake of the gospel, their mistreatment for the sake of the gospel, their sacrifice was not in vain. Now the millennium proves that what they sacrificed, what they suffered under the rule of Satan and under oppressive governments like the Roman Empire was not in vain. That was not the last word. But now the last word is Christ vindicates them. God vindicates them by raising them and letting them rule with Christ. Eugene Peterson, some of you are familiar with Eugene Peterson. He wrote, he's responsible for the translation known as The Message. But he wrote a really helpful devotional on Revelation called Reverse Thunder. And each chapter is labeled something like the last word on judgment, the last word on whatever. Each chapter of the book on Revelation is the last word. And you can kind of see chapter 20 this is God's last word on the church, what he thinks about his people and their sacrifice and whether it was worth it. And in chapter 20, the millennium is meant to demonstrate, no, what they suffered under the dragon, what they suffered at the hands of the world is worth it. And the fact that now God vindicates them by raising them and having them reign with Christ is a demonstration that their sacrifice was worth it. This is God's last word on whether the saints' sacrifice, even to the point of death, was worth it. So in the context of judging Satan, the guilty party, now God vindicates those who were wrongfully accused, who were wrongfully treated by Satan, who were mistreated at the hands of the world. And now they are raised and they reign with Christ. So I take the millennium in chapter 20. Again, the 1,000 years is not to be taken literally. It's a metaphor, a symbol for, again, a completeness, a vast number that suggests that this vindication, raising them, far exceeds anything that they had to suffer at the hands of the beast. In fact, and at the hands of the dragon, Satan. In fact, it probably contrasts with some of the numbers that you find in chapter 11, 12, and 13 that refer to the period of tribulation. 3.5 years, 42 months, 1,260 days. Those numbers, those shorter numbers, described the character of the period of tribulation. Now their vindication is ascribed with a far greater number, 1,000 years. So again, the message of the millennium is this is the vindication of the saints. God, in the context of judging Satan, who put them to death and who ruled over them, who wrongfully accused them, now the saints are vindicated. And the 1,000 years is meant to show this is so much greater. Anything that they suffered on this earth is far overshadowed by this vindication, by being raised and reigning with Christ. So that's how I understand the millennium, and it really doesn't fit really well within any of those three categories, the post-millennial, premillennial, amillennial, but I think it's a view that accurately describes what appears to be going on in Revelation 20.